Okay, let's start. It's about time. Hello, everyone. Salam, namaste, adab, and welcome to today's event. Today, we are going to have the discussion on the Muslim universities and Indian politics after partition. And the speaker is Dr. Laurence Gautier. I don't know. I'm trying. Gautier.
Gautier.
Gautier, the French kind of thing. Yeah. And she is a faculty at the Center of Sciences, Humans, CHS, New Delhi. Her focus has been education, national integration, and secularism in plural societies. She is a political historian, author, and researcher. She will be joined by a lone discussant here, Professor David Lelyveld, a very familiar face on this forum. He is a league also. He's a professor, retired professor of history at William Patterson University, New Jersey. And he's a famous author of the book, Aligarh's First Generation Muslim Solidarity in British India. And he's a co-editor of A Wilderness of Possibilities, Urdu Studies in Translation Perspective. Laurence Gautier she holds a PhD in history from University of Cambridge. Before CHS, she was in the Jindal Liberal Arts. Her research examines on the debates around Indian Muslims' position in the nation after partition as citizens and as a minority groups. They have published wonderful articles also on Sir Syed, Aligarh Muslim University, Jamia Millia Islamia, and related things. Their research basically focuses on the Muslim universities and Muslim heritage in South Asia. So welcome you all. And with this brief introduction, now I invite Dr. Laurence Gautier.
Thank you very much, Razi Sahib, for inviting me, first of all. This is a great opportunity for me to present my book, which has just come out with Cambridge University Press. I would also like to thank Professor David Lelyveld, who's of course been a major point of reference for this work. And not just that, he's also been a very kind, he's been extremely supportive throughout the PhD and after. So I'm extremely happy that he's accepted to be the discussant today for this session. So I would like to present my book, which is quite a task because the book is more than 400 pages long. So I'll try to be as concise as possible. Let me start straight away. So the book, which is entitled Between Nation and Community, but Muslim Universities and Indian Politics After Partition, is essentially a political history of these two Muslim universities in the post-independence context. And my objective was to look at these educational institutions mostly as political sites that have played a central part in the debate on Muslims' location in India's nation state after independence. So the book starts around partition and stops in the 1990s. In line with Habermas, the idea was to highlight the critical role that academic institutions have to play in the self-understanding that a society has of itself. There is already a well-established tradition in Indian historiography that shows the political role of educational institutions during the colonial period, as education emerged as a contested terrain between the colonizers and the colonized, as well as within the Indian population. Could we go to the next slide, please? So among all the important works in that field, I have in mind, in the case of Muslim institutions more particularly, the well-known studies, of course, of Professor Lelyveld, as well as Barbara Metcalf on the MAO College and Deoband, that embodied different responses to the establishment of colonial rule, from accommodation to the new regime in one case, to efforts to carve out an autonomous religious sphere, or even open opposition in the other. And in the process, these institutions contributed to developing the idea that Indian Muslims formed a pan-Indian Muslim community, despite the many ongoing differences that persisted among Indian Muslims. Now, as Professor Lelyveld has argued, Sir Syed, I'm sure that many of you are already very familiar with the history of AMU. I just want to go back to a few points regarding the colonial period. So as Professor Lelivet has argued, Sir Said established the MAO College in 1875 to provide modern education to Muslim students, primarily students from elite backgrounds, so that they may retain access to circles of power after the fall of the Mughal Empire. The college was to train Muslim elites so that they may act as the leaders of the Muslim Ummah, which was considered as a pan-Indian entity, and that, of course, was a rather novel idea. College authorities really perceived the MAO College as a center meant to serve Muslims throughout the subcontinent. And they were also closely associated, as is well known, with the foundation of the Muslim League, which claimed to speak for all Indian Muslims. From the beginning, however, the college claimed to act and speak for the entire Muslim population of the subcontinent was much disputed. Within the college itself, there was no consensus regarding the political orientation of the institution. And as anti-colonial feelings rose in the early 20th century, sections of the college increasingly challenged the loyalist attitude of the college authorities. And of course, the foundation of the Jamia Millia Islamia, the other institution at the heart of this study, is a testimony to these divisions. Former Aligarh students played a key role in the establishment of the National Islamic University, Jamia Millia Islamia, in 1920, in the wake of the Khilafat movement and of Gandhi's non-cooperation movement. And as you probably all know, unlike the AMU, Jamia remained fully independent from colonial state authorities. They also distanced themselves from the Muslim League and remained firmly committed to the ideal of a united India, including at the time of partition. So that's why very often Jamia is seen as the quintessential nationalist Muslim institution. Now, my book builds on these well-known studies dedicated to the colonial period to look at the role of these institutions after independence. By shifting attention to the post-colonial period, new questions arise. For example, what relations did these two institutions develop with the new state authorities? How did partition affect their political stature? And what role did they endorse in the nation-building project? What we must remember is that for the new state authorities after independence, educational institutions, especially universities, had a critical role to play in nation building. First, to develop economic and industrial infrastructure to ensure the viability of the new Indian state, but also to foster what the University Education Commission called the spiritual unity of the nation, especially in the aftermath of partition. So the question then is, within this framework, what role did state authorities envision for Muslim universities? Why did I focus specifically on these institutions? What was interesting for me was that unlike private Muslim schools or madrasas, after independence, both AMU and Jamia became public institutions controlled by the state. AMU became a central university in 1951. It was one of the first central universities in the country. And Jamia became a deemed university in 1962, before it became a central university in 1988. As such, these universities found themselves at a critical juncture between central state authorities and India's Muslim population. As state-sponsored universities, they were to train citizens and to contribute to national integration and development. And as Muslim institutions, they were expected to promote primarily the interests of Indian Muslims and to transmit the cultural legacy of the specific community. Hence my interest in these two institutions whose trajectories were both distinct and closely intertwined. Now, what are the main arguments of the book? If we can move to the next slide, this would be perfect. So my first argument is that these institutions served as platforms to imagine the nation. And this is an important point here, because we often think of minority-led institutions as confined primarily to the community that they're supposed to serve. But here, what I really want to emphasize is that these institutions played a critical part in producing counter-narratives to majoritarian representations of the nation. They aim to play a role for the nation, not just for the community. Second, central state authorities regarded these institutions as intermediaries through which they could speak to India's Muslim population. So here, by examining these institutions, I also try to examine the state's attitude towards Muslim citizens more largely, and to highlight the ambivalences of the state's secular nationalism, in the sense that after partition, state authorities firmly opposed separate political representation for religious minorities. So for example, as we know, the constitution got rid of separate electorates, but at the same time, in practice, state authorities continue to address religious minorities, especially Indian Muslims, as a separate population, very often through Muslim institutions. My third argument is that these universities constituted major centers for different strands of Muslim politics in post-independence India. Their political role was all the more important in the absence of strong Muslim political parties in North India. What I said earlier, that education was critical to nation building after independence, but it was also critical to community building. Remember that education was one of the few fields in which religious minorities were granted specific rights in the constitution. So in this context, Muslim universities became both objects and arenas of debates involving a wide range of actors, students, teachers, university authorities, but also community actors and state actors who all felt that they had a role to play in the running of these institutions. And so the idea is that by closely looking at the debates that took place within and around these institutions, to explore these universities as crucibles for competing conceptions of Muslim location in the nation state after partition. I'm not going to say much about the sources that I use, but very briefly, I use a very wide range of sources in English and in Urdu. Official archives, of course, to examine the state's perspective on these institutions, but also university archives, both documents produced by the authorities as well as by the students, like students' pamphlets or magazines. I also carried out interviews and looked at newspapers and magazines. Let me go straight away to my first point, which is to look at these institutions as laboratories for a composite nation. So if we can move, so I think there's a slide after that on sources, we can skip that and move straight to the next one. Thank you. So the first two chapters of the book look at the efforts of Jamia and Aligarh to promote the idea of India as a composite nation. These efforts to promote national integration did not merely result from state-led policies. The university members envisioned themselves as partners rather than just followers of the nation-building efforts of Nehru's government. So in the first chapter, I show how Jamia members sought, even before partition, to give meaning to India's future independence through their pedagogical and social initiatives. And so they sought to give meaning to India's independence, not just for Muslims, of course, but for all Indians. After the end of the non-cooperation movement, Jamia authorities, who were led then by Zakir Hussain, transformed Jamia into an experimental school, which was primarily focused on basic and adult education. They drew inspiration from progressive educationists and abroad, as well as Gandhi. At the heart of their pedagogical project, you had first central importance given to manual work and creative activities. As you can see here on this magazine picture. Another characteristic feature of their educational model was the importance of the vernacular language, so simple Urdu over English as the main medium of instruction. These choices reflected a double objective. First, Jamia teachers sought to address not just elites, but also the non-elites. They saw education as a tool of social reform. And this also explains why they made the promotion of adult education one of their main objectives. Second, they sought to resist the growing polarization along communal lines, including through language. So they made both Hindi and Urdu, for example, compulsory subjects. Much like Gandhi, Jamia authorities envisioned basic education as an alternative to the colonial model of education and as a foundation for a new national system of education. So again, the idea of the nation was very prominent. In 1937, Gandhi appointed Zakir Hussain at the head of the Varda committee in charge of drafting a new scheme of education. Zakir Hussain did not merely replicate Gandhi's ideas on education. In fact, he would be quite critical of them, especially, for example, the idea that schools should rely on children's work for funding. So with his colleagues in the Varda committee, he reformulated Gandhi's contentious ideas to avoid, I quote here one of the educationists in the committee, to avoid turning schools into little factories of spinning and weaving. So in this way, Jamia members, especially Zakir Hussain, played a leading part in shaping what came to be seen as the Gandhian model of education, which was meant for the future independent nation. Jamia's strong patriotic stance was deeply imbued with Islamic values. Contrary to the idea that more religion leads to more communalism, Zakir Hussain defended the idea that it was the false interpretation of Islamic principles, not Islam itself, that had led to the rise of communalism. In 1937, at a time when there were growing tensions between the Muslim and the Congress, he contrasted the new Muslim schools like Jamia, which according to him were based on Islamic ideals, with what he called the old system of Muslim education, identified with, and I quote him here, one class of Muslims looking to preserve their self-interests. That was a not so hidden reference to AMU, which they accused of pursuing the interests of Muslim elites in the garb of religion. Zakir Hussain and his colleagues made the notion of service a central part of Jamia's ethos. In their eyes, service to society constituted both a religious and a patriotic duty. As Muslims, Zakir Hussain argued, we are committed to the attainment and maintenance of freedom and to the removal of slavery, ignorance, and poverty. By claiming simultaneously a strong attachment to Islamic values and to the national cause, Jamia teachers, of course, opposed the instrumental use of religion, but they also challenged Hindu majoritarian discourses, which projected Islam as an alien religion. Jamia's faculty remained committed to the one nation policy, including at the time of partition, as I said, even though partition riots very directly affected the institution. So at the time of partition and in its immediate aftermath, they presented Hindu-Muslim reconciliation as the cornerstone of the nation's reconstruction. For example, some of Jamia's students opened a school in North Delhi for refugees and local Muslim children. At Jamia itself, teachers hosted Hindu and Sikh refugee children on campus and introduced classes in Hindu ethics alongside Islamic studies. In class, they stressed the multi-religious legacy of India's culture. Can we move to the next slide? I want to show you a picture basically of a timeline. Thank you. A timeline that was hung in the Delhi's museum, which was a museum within Jamia itself, where you can see clearly how Jamia teachers make it a point to include monuments associated with, India's different religious traditions as part of one, shared history. They also published booklets for neo-literate adults on Islam, as well as on the Vedas, the Guru Granth Sahib, the Bible, and the Upanishads. This discourse on India's composite culture was very much in line with the attempts of Nehru and his education minister, Maulana Azad, to harness education and culture in order to promote national integration. But again, it's important to remember that Jamia teachers did not merely replicate this state discourse. In fact, they were the ones taking direct initiatives that were then emulated or used by the state. For example, Azad's ministry took notice of Jamia's booklets, praised them as very popular and useful for the village folk. Remember that these were booklets meant primarily for neo-literate adults, and they chose to distribute them. So my point here is that instead of thinking of emotional integration as a state-led project, we need to show how it emerged from not a single source, but from an ongoing dialogue between state and non-state actors. At the time, Jamia was not yet under state control. And so a dialogue between state and non-state actors, including Muslim institutions, that were all confronted to the immense challenge of ensuring peace and unity in post-partition India. For Muslims especially, to promote an inclusive conception of the nation was also an attempt to assert their right to belong as unhyphenated Indians to the nation. What is surprising is that despite the obvious ideological and political proximity between Jamia and the Congress, especially Nehru and Gandhi, Nehru's government paid actually limited attention to Jamia after independence and provided limited financial support. This is all the more paradoxical if you consider that Nehru's government paid much attention to the AMU at a time when AMU was widely seen as a hotbed of Muslim separatism. So I will try to explain, to give you my interpretation of this paradox. I argue that basically this differential treatment reflected the ambivalences of the state's secular nationalism. So that's my second point. I want to look at universities as intermediaries for central state authorities. We can move on to the next slide, please. In chapter 2, I look at AMU in the immediate aftermath of partition, at a time when the institution was basically undergoing deep transformation. In the last years of colonial rule, the Muslim League had gained increasing influence on campus at the expense of left and pro-Congress sections of the university. Many students and teachers took an active part in the Muslim League campaign for Pakistan. In this context, partition provoked a major crisis for the university. Not only did it lose about half of its students and the support of its private patrons, it was also widely seen, as I said, as a hotbed of Muslim separatism. However, in this context, Nehru and Azad did not try to punish the university, but instead to send a reassuring message. When Nehru visited the university in 1948, 1 year after independence, he told students, "Do not think that you are outsiders here, for you are as much flesh and blood of India as anyone else." And this was a message not just for university members, but also more largely for Indian Muslims. Nehru's government may have paid little attention to Jamia, which they considered to be primarily a Gandhian institution. But by contrast, they clearly identified AMU as a Muslim institution and a center of Muslim politics. And it is precisely for this reason that they turned towards this institution. They saw AMU as a potent intermediary through which they could address Indian Muslims and try to rally them to the state's nation-building project. Zakir Hussain, who became AMU's vice-chancellor in 1948 with the support of Nehru and Azad, shared a similar view. In a letter to Rajendra Prasad, he wrote, "To me, the work at Aligarh signified no less than the handling at one of the most significant centers of the chief problem with which Indian statesmanship is faced, the problem of an integrated nationhood in a secular democratic state. The despondent Muslim masses are scattered all over the country. We can dissipate the efforts to revive hope and faith in them. But if we do something significant at Aligarh, it can electrify them." So the idea was really to make AMU the center that could revive hope and faith, to use Zakir Hussain's words, among Muslims throughout the country. Together, Nehru, Azad, and Zakir Hussain aimed to reorient the university so that in order to transform what was known as the arsenal of Muslim India, this is an expression by Jinnah, to transform this arsenal of Muslim India into a symbol and an instrument of national integration. But for this transformation to happen, university members first had to sift their legacy in order to detach themselves from their Muslim League legacy, in order to prove their undivided loyalty to the Indian nation state. The 1951 Act, which granted AMU Central University status, was a key step in this reform, and in the sense that it reinforced the state control over the institution. It also opened up the court, which was AMU's main administrative body, to non-Muslims, and made religion non-compulsory. To reform the institution, Zakir Hussain could rely on the support of significant sections of the university. He was not just the only one who was party to this reform. So there were significant sections of the university, especially those associated with the left or with the Congress, that were keen to show that AMU could play a special role in the nation-building enterprise. So to do that, for example, they highlighted AMU's legacy as a repository of Ganga Yamuna Tehzeeb. They also put forward the unique composition of the students' body in the sense that AMU had not only a large number of Muslim students, but also a large minority of non-Muslim students, about 20 to 30%. They also had students coming from different states of the subcontinent. And this is why Abdul Alim, who was professor of Arabic at the time, considered that AMU was an ideal laboratory to develop what he called a new form of Indian culture. However, there was no consensus on the extent of this reorientation, including among those who supported these reforms. To give you an example, both Nehru and Azad supported dropping the name, the word Muslim from the university's name, a change that Zakir Hussain firmly opposed. On the one side, and so here, once again, we see the ambiguities of the Congress secular nationalism. On the one side, Azad and Nehru clearly identified AMU as a Muslim institution. On the other, they feared that to explicitly highlight AMU's Muslim character may revive communal tensions and hamper the nation's unity. These ambivalences, as well as the strong anti-Muslim bias of UP Congress in that period, fueled apprehensions among certain sections of the university, who feared that the reforms would erase AMU's Muslim character. Some even accused Zakir Hussain of carrying out a shudhi of the institution. More largely, these tensions captured a growing discontent towards the Congress among North Indian Muslims, as many feared that state authorities were trying to impose a majoritarian conception of Indian culture in the garb of national unity. And so already in the 1950s, these tensions are quite palpable. So that, of course, goes against the idea that there was a Nehruvian consensus in the early independence period. Actually, you see that these tensions are already on the rise very early after independence. And they came to a head in the 1960s as the government proved unable to contain the resurgence of communal riots. And so that will be my third point. We can please move to the next slide. I want to talk about the resurgence of minority politics here. So in chapter 3, I examined the campaign for AMU's minority status, which started in 1965. I argue that this campaign played a pivotal role in the emergence of a form of Muslim politics, which was primarily focused on the defense of religious minority rights. The campaign participated in the larger pluralization of Indian politics in the 1960s, which was marked by the erosion of the Congress dominance much before the post-emergency crisis. So we often see 1977, the end of emergency, as a major turning point in Indian politics. But what we have to understand is that already there was increasing political competition and an erosion of the Congress dominance much before that, especially in UP. Now, unlike previous campaigns for the official recognition of Urdu, which were quite important in the 1950s, the demand for AMU's minority status was projected as a Muslim demand, whereas in the 1950s, the demand for the recognition of Urdu was framed in terms of linguistic minority rights. Here it was framed, by contrast, as a Muslim demand. The controversy started as an internal dispute over student quotas, but it soon became a major Muslim issue as the students' agitation transformed into a massive mobilization for the recognition of AMU's minority status. Muslim organizations played a key role in this transformation. The campaign took off in 1965, as I said, which was just 1 year after the formation of the Majlis-e-Mushawarat, an umbrella organization that brought together heterogeneous Muslim groups. The Jamiatul Ulema, which had been a long-term ally of the Congress, but also the Jamaat-e-Islami and the Indian Union Muslim League, which had very different political stances. Now, the formation of this unprecedented alliance epitomized the rise of a more assertive form of Muslim politics, which was more openly critical of the government's failure to protect Muslim citizens. The Aligarh campaign provided these actors a platform to bolster their claim to speak for all Muslims, as they made special efforts to build support among Muslims in different parts of the country. It also became a testing ground for issue-based coalition by bringing together heterogeneous forces. So what do I mean by issue-based coalition? I mean basically very loose coalitions with actors coming from very different backgrounds, which may not have very similar political leanings, but that nonetheless come together to defend one specific issue. So in this case, it was AMU's minority status. But what we see is that in the following decades, especially in the absence of a strong Muslim political party, this type of issue-based coalition quickly became the dominant form of Muslim politics in North India. You can think, for example, of the All India Muslim Personnel Law Board or the Babri Masjid Action Committee, which were all focused on specific issues. The campaign reinforced the notion that Indian Muslims formed a distinct entity with shared rights and interests. And the state authorities themselves consolidated this notion as they repeatedly negotiated with Muslim organizations over the AMU issue in the hope of securing the support of Muslim voters. At the same time, the campaign demonstrated the gap between AMU's claim to speak for all Muslims and the deep divisions that persisted even within the campus itself. It also showed the limits of the influence of Muslim coalitions over state authorities. It is only in 1981, so 16 years after the beginning of the campaign, that the Congress, which had just come back to power, finally conceded most of their demands in a context where basically the Congress was very much wary of losing the support of Muslim voters after their historic defeat in 1977. So it is only in this very specific political context with a rise in political competition that the Congress finally conceded not explicitly the minority status to AMU, but almost. Now, I want to move on to the fourth point, which is alternatives to minority politics. Through the campaign for minority status, AMU occupied center stage in Muslim politics for more than 15 years. But there was no consensus regarding minority politics, neither at AMU nor at Jamia. And so in the following chapters 4, 5, and 6, I show how in both these institutions, other forms of politics unfolded, which challenged the legitimacy of a politics which was focused primarily on the defense of Muslims' minority rights. At Jamia, university authorities and faculty firmly held on to the composite nationalism of their predecessors. Unlike at AMU, Jamia's faculty did not claim minority status to protect Jamia's Muslim character until well into the 1990s. They feared that this status would tag them as a communal institution and would reduce their scope of action. So they sought instead to highlight the institution's long-term commitment to the nation's unity without erasing its Muslim markers. For this, they paid special attention to the development of Urdu medium education, which had always been one of Jamia's main characteristic features. In the 1970s, they proposed to transform Jamia into a central Urdu university with affiliated colleges throughout the country. Now, that was quite a daring move if you consider that Jamia was still a small institution at the time and was not even recognized yet as a full-fledged university. So this plan failed. But what is interesting here for us is that Jamia teachers insisted on Urdu's trans-communal character, which was, of course, a way to resist the fast marginalization of the language as a minority language after independence. Paul Brass has argued that the defense of Urdu was primarily a secular cover for the pursuit of Muslim minority interests. But here I argue instead that it was a way to uphold a vision of the nation in which Islamic symbols could be valued as an integral part of Indians' shared legacy. Jamia authorities again distanced themselves from minority politics in the 1980s when they led a campaign to obtain full university status. To justify this demand, they repeatedly invoked Jamia's historical character, which was an expression that allowed them to avoid the minority tag without having to erase Jamia's distinctive trajectory as a nationalist Muslim institution. The Congress, however, was unwilling to include explicit reminders of Jamia's unique character in the Parliamentary Act. The parliamentary debates on this issue reflected once again the ambiguities of the Congress. By granting Jamia Central University status, the party sought to convey a message of goodwill towards Muslim citizens, but at the same time, they remained reluctant to openly include Jamia's Muslim markers in the parliamentary bill. For example, the fact that it had been established by Muslim founders and that it was meant primarily, though not exclusively, for Muslim students. As the Hindu right was on the rise, they feared that such move may trigger a Hindu backlash. Neither the Congress nor even Jamia's authorities seemed to have the adequate language to justify a policy that would simultaneously uphold both the national and the Muslim character of the institution. Even the teachers' demand to preserve the historical character of Jamia was itself remarkably vague. It offered little response to those who increasingly attacked any pro-Muslim measure as a form of minority appeasement. And to step away from this secular versus communal binary that you find in the secular nationalist discourse, university authorities at both Jamia and Aligarh increasingly frame their demands and policies in terms of Muslims' socioeconomic uplift, which is the object of Chapter 5. We can move to the next slide, that would be great. Several scholars in the 1990s, as well as Pasmanda activists, have argued that the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992 introduced a sharp break in Muslim politics. According to them, the demolition of the Babri Masjid exposed traditional Muslim leaders, whom they held partly responsible for the rise of communal tensions, and also highlighted the need for an alternative strategy, which was more focused on economic development and social justice. In practice, however, it is difficult to completely oppose development and identity politics, or even to argue that elite Muslim politics continuously ignored socioeconomic issues before the 1990s. The question of Muslim socioeconomic backwardness had been a recurrent theme in Muslim politics since the colonial period. It received renewed attention in the 1970s and 80s. So here, several factors came into play. One, the increasing feeling of being neglected by the state, combined with the increased consciousness that large sections of the Muslim population were lagging behind in terms of development. This was also a time marked by the growing influence of caste-based politics and the rise of new Muslim middle classes. So in this context, the question of Muslims' backwardness and socioeconomic uplift became absolutely central. Muslim educational institutions, including, of course, Aligarh and Jamia, played a leading role in the renewal of these discussions. During this period, a number of religious associations and political leaders, as well as professionals and businessmen, mobilized to set up new Muslim educational institutions in different parts of the country, especially in southern India. Likewise, AMU and Jamia authorities insisted on the need to expand opportunities for disadvantaged Muslims. Now, this development-oriented policy could serve to shift attention away from community-centric claims. This was the case, for example, at Jamia under Anwar Jamal Kidwai in the late 1970s and early 80s. Jamia, which earlier was a small school in the rural periphery of Delhi, by then had started to become part of the city's fabric. Its neighborhood was attracting increasing numbers of migrants who were looking for better job opportunities in the capital. In this context, Kidwai insisted on the need to develop job-oriented courses that could have, I quote him here, that could have a large impact on Muslim unemployment in Delhi and its surrounding areas. According to him, what characterized Jamia students was their backwardness more than their Muslimness per se. I cite him here. The student population of Jamia is mixed in respect of religion, region, and sex. However, there is one major common factor, that is the lack of resources and general backwardness. Here, Kidwai did not deny that most of Jamia students were still Muslim, but he clearly prioritized socioeconomic development as an objective over community-centric claims. And I would argue that much like Nehru before him, he feared that to highlight Jamia's denominational character may fuel inward-looking tendencies and threaten the efforts of the school to provide better job opportunities to students. In practice, however, development politics often remain closely intertwined with the defense of community-based interests. This was particularly true at AMU, where university authorities continued to project the university as an all-India Muslim institution, which was meant to serve the entire Muslim community. The AMU Act, which was adopted by Parliament in 1981, strengthened this claim. It officially recognized that AMU's mission was to promote the educational advancement of all Indian Muslims. Here, both university and state authorities endorsed the idea that Muslim citizens formed a separate category of citizens whose access to state support was to be mediated by Muslim institutions like AMU. So within this framework, development politics became an alternative form of Muslim politics rather than an alternative to Muslim politics. Promoting Muslims' socioeconomic uplift was a very consensual objective by the 1980s. However, and so it is increasingly in this framework that university authorities frame their actions. However, in the same period, a growing number of students adopted a much less consensual objective. That was to promote the superiority of what they called pure Islam and to defend the Ummah against Islam's enemies. This is the object of chapter 6. What I show in this chapter is that part of the student body found in this discourse, the discourse of the defense of Islam, which was initially championed by Islamist groups, a sense of empowerment that minority politics failed to convey. At AMU, students affiliated with the Jamaat-e-Islami envisioned themselves as the vanguards of an Islamic movement which was meant to rejuvenate the community. The students pushed for a reform of the university so that it may align with their conception of Islamic values and become the center of the Islamic movement that they were calling for. And surprisingly, their call to purify Islam and the university had deeply divisive effects on the campus, in the sense that it marginalized non-Muslim students and antagonized Muslim students who did not share the same conception of Islam. However, these groups gained increasing influence in the 1980s as they positioned themselves as the champions of an Islam in danger, at a time when the Hindu right was on the rise. Their influence peaked in the early 1990s as the Rath Yatra to Ayodhya gave an immediate resonance to their call to defend Islam. Even at Jamia, this rhetoric gained increasing appeal. In 1992, just a few months before the demolition of the Babri Masjid, a major controversy erupted around Salman Rushdie's contentious novel, The Satanic Verses. There too, large sections of students mobilized on an unprecedented scale, calling for the defense of Islam against its internal and external enemies. In the process, they projected Jamia as a Muslim symbol and a bastion of an embattled community. The demolition of the Babri Masjid in December 1992 dealt a major blow to these politics of self-assertion and shrill contestation. It was a brutal exposure of the balance of power that the Hindu right intended to put in place. In this context, few students chose to follow a path of further radicalization. Despite a widespread sense of frustration, many preferred instead to turn within towards a more apolitical interpretation of Islam. Others still sought an alternative to communal politics by putting renewed emphasis on Muslim socioeconomic uplift. So in so doing, they highlighted once again the leading role that Muslim universities had to play in this reorientation. First, as instruments of Muslims' educational uplift. Second, as platforms from where a new leadership and new forms of Muslim politics could emerge. Now, I don't know if I realize that I've already been very long. I would like to speak about women, which is the object of my chapter 7. Can I have 5 minutes? I mean, 3 more minutes to finish this presentation and include women?
Yes, of course. You can take as much as you want.
Thank you very much. So far, I've not spoken much about women, and this is partly because women initially occupied a marginal position both at Jamia and AMU for some time. Like most educational institutions established during the colonial period, Jamia and AMU were initially established by men, for men. There was no Muslim exception here. So Chapter 7 traces women's trajectory from the margins to a more central position in both these institutions. It also examines whether and how AMU and Jamia's Muslim character affected discussions on women's status in these institutions. Like in many other institutions, women's education remained for a long time essentially a class project, which was focused on the formation of companionate wives. After independence, it was recast as a nationalist project, training dutiful female citizens, serving society. Preserving Muslim identity, in other words, was not the prime objective of women's education in these institutions. In the 1970s and 80s, however, the rise of Islamist groups and the larger debates about Muslim personal law put increasing pressure on women students and teachers to position themselves as Muslim women first. With the rise of communal tensions, many women internalized the idea that adopting a critical stance, either towards their institutions or towards Muslim personal law, could be seen as a form of betrayal, exposing their community to further attacks. As Muslim women, students and teachers were expected to prioritize the defense of their institutions and beyond of their community. Women learned to negotiate their location on campus within this framework. For example, for teachers, it was often by promoting women's access to higher education, rather than by challenging head-on gender inequalities or patriarchal notions of Muslim culture, that they hoped to open new opportunities for their female students. But this may be changing. In recent years, both Aligarh and Jamia have been witness to protests and campaigns led by female students, which directly targeted gender-based inequalities. I have in mind the mobilization of students of the Women's College at AMU to access the Central Library, or Jamia's campaign called Pads Against Sexism in 2015. This reflects a larger trend on Indian campuses where we see increasingly women mobilizing. For journalist Neha Dixit, the 2012 anti-rape movement marked a turning point in women's mobilization, especially in universities. And this was, of course, reflected in our two institutions. For example, in 2015, students from Jamia Millia initiated a campaign, Pinjra Tor, Break the Cage, to protest against restrictions imposed upon women students. This campaign quickly spread to other campuses. So here, against the flawed assumption that Muslim women are more shy and subdued than others, this campaign showed instead that female students in Muslim universities could play a leading part in these mobilizations. This may help partly explain why female students at Jamia and Aligarh occupied such a prominent position in the recent anti-CAA protests. Many of them had actually taken an active part in earlier campus-based protests, often fighting for women-related issues. Moreover, this time there was no question of betraying one's institution or community, quite on the opposite. With the anti-CAA protests, women fought for the survival of a secular nation state in which Indian Muslims, both men and women, are to be recognized as equal citizens. Now, a few words of conclusion. The book has argued that AMU and Jamia have played a central part in the debates on Muslims' vocation in the Indian nation. As objects and arenas of debates, they have channeled competing conceptions of what it means to be an Indian Muslim after independence. Aligarh and Jamia remain today important Muslim symbols for their supporters as well as for their detractors. For many students, and arguably for a number of Indian Muslims outside these universities, AMU and Jamia are associated with a glorious past and with the promise of a better future. For others, however, they remain hotbeds of separatism that epitomize Muslims' allegedly communal tendencies. This was reflected, of course, during the anti-CAA protests, when students were accused of being jihadis or anti-national. These protests also showed that university campuses continue to play a crucial role as platforms for democratic debates beyond political parties. This democratic function has become all the more important in a context where opposition parties are sometimes reluctant to challenge head-on the narrative of the dominant party, especially on the Muslim question. In the recent years, key opposition parties, starting with the Congress, have grown wary of being tagged as pro-Muslim. In this context, students' vocal protests against the CAA sharply contrast with the restraint of opposition parties. Through these mobilizations, Aligarh and Jamia do not only serve as Muslim symbols, they also continue to provide, much like in the early independence period, platforms to develop non-majoritarian conceptions of the nation where Muslims can be recognized as full-fledged citizens. Thank you. I will stop here.
Wonderful. So if we can, yeah, thank you very much. And now let's listen to Professor David, and then we will come to question answer. So David.
Well, first of all, I am a bit overwhelmed by Dr. Gautier's presentation and beyond that, her wonderful book, which is so full of information and so lucidly presented. I want to step back from it a little bit and think about who we are here in this group, including myself, who enter that history at various points in various ways. In my case, I entered the history of Aligarh completely naive, not knowing anything of the background that I walked into in 1967, 2 years after one of the major events of student protests in which the vice chancellor was assaulted and the university was put under a kind of receivership by the Minister of Education, Mr. Chagla. That was in 1965. So I didn't know what I was walking into. And it was a very tense place filled with angry people at each other. And it brings to mind what's happening now on college campuses, including right next to me at Columbia University. And the whole, something that is very much in the book, but wasn't in Laurence's presentation, is the role of student politics and the role of student protest in making universities sites for politics. That's not what, normally we go to colleges as students and teachers, and we teach our courses and we have friends, and life goes on. In my case, I spent 2 years at Aligarh in the late 60s, and then occasionally I've made brief visits from time to time, not without the continuity that many of you have. And you entered into that story at different times at Aligarh or Jamia or at other institutions from different perspectives. What Laurence has presented us is a kind of overview from outside, and basically I'm tried to do that in a very distant historical past. The question of what continuities there are between Aligarh origins and Sir Syed and the very different institution that exists now in a very different context. Some of the themes seem to repeat themselves. It's interesting, this issue of loyalty. That was a word that was used much in Sir Syed's time, and he meant loyalty to the British Empire. And the goal of the political goal, and in some sense the cultural goal, was enfranchisement within the empire. He didn't think about nation states. And what independence and partition presented as a new kind of problem to Indians in general and Indian Muslims in particular was how to live under these new conditions. And the first thing that particularly at Jamia and Aligarh University was to assert their loyalty, which was put in terms of emotional integration or something of that sort, to be part of the assimilated into the whole, like Taleb's drop of water in the stream. And that had to do, for example, as Laurence points out, with the role of Urdu. Urdu had been partitioned itself, Urdu Hindi had been partitioned. That was a long story. And then Urdu basically was pushed aside. And Jamia, actually, although it was a small place, was culturally very influential. And it was influential, by the way, at Aligarh itself. Laurence mentions Abul Alim, who came from Jamia as an Arabic professor to Aligarh. Of course, Zakir Hussain was the early vice chancellor in the years of independence, and they brought to it a Jamia mentality. I remember hearing them speak Urdu with this wonderful clarity and simplicity that even I could understand easily. There was something, a special Jamia style. And then others came. There was a great presence, and it was very important to me, of Marxists at Aligarh. And that has remained it. And my mentor at that time, who had been a visiting professor in my graduate school, Professor Irfan Habib, who is still going strong, I'm happy to say, brought me into his circle, the Marxist study group, which is mentioned in Laurence's book. And but of course, if I was on that side, then I was kept at a distance by other people. And also, when I went there, I was treated as by some people as a somewhat suspicious character. Why was the CIA interested in the history of society and all of that? In any case, for Muslims in India, the issue of conceiving Muslims as an entity, as a Muslims of all India as an entity, was presented as a problem to think about and to organize and to do something about. And much of that, as represented in Laurence's book, is a matter of disagreement and responding to different challenges. I would just I was thinking as I reread her book. I read it when it was a PhD thesis, and it's much expanded from that. There was when Fanon's Damné de la Terre, the Wretched of the Earth, has an introduction by Jean-Paul Sartre in which he argues that the condition of the Jews in Europe, the oppression of the Jews, this was written just after World War II and Hitler and all of that, is what perpetuates Jewish identity. And that was responded to by Hannah Arendt by saying, no, Jews have their own agency and their own culture and their own motivations. And so what that part of politics, which is generated out of one's own experience and culture, has to be put in relationship to the challenges, and in this case, the rising challenge, which is now mounted overwhelmingly of a Hindutva concept of India, which even existed in the early times. The idea that India's basic culture was Hindu, that it was rooted in ancient India and ancient Indian texts and ancient Indian art and culture, and that Muslims should adapt to it. The question is, do you compartmentalize your cultural life as a kind of private matter, and or do you try to be part of the overwhelming dominant culture? Now, the question of whether there really was an overwhelming dominant culture, that's a whole other question of the unity of Hinduism. This is an ongoing process. It's also the case that Muslims live in the larger world, and they were following what goes on in the larger world, some more than others, and most particularly across the border into Pakistan, where many people had family and relatives and so on. Many people, as Laurence pointed, left Aligarh at the time of partition, and then there was just a trickle after that, and often it was a matter of seeking a better job or something of that sort, and the people went to Pakistan because of a marriage arrangement or something like that, not out of any particular ideological motivation. But nonetheless, it was there. Pakistan was there. You couldn't always get the books from Pakistan, and the Urdu literature was sometimes difficult to get a hold of back and forth, but still it was there as a presence. Nonetheless, Muslims were, for the first time, a minority in a modern nation state. And it wasn't just in India, but it was most importantly in India. But many of you came to the United States or the United Kingdom or Canada or something, where you were no longer part of a majority community, which is most of the history of most of Muslims in the world. So that creates new kinds of problems, and I would argue new kinds of opportunities also to stand away from the majority. So those are other kinds of contexts and other kinds of perspectives that one might want to look at. To think of the university itself, Aligarh and Jamia, when it ultimately became a university, as a platform for political discussion, disagreement, and as an intermediary with the state is important. But as some of the critics of Aligarh and even Jamia argued, there were other sites and other places in which Aligarh was rather distant. I want to say just one other thing about the word elite. Especially since some of it gets attributed to me. I thought that during the colonial period, the real elite were the British, and that a lot of the people who went to Aligarh, there were some wealthy landlords and so on, no doubt, and they were important, but a lot of people were from very modest backgrounds, from military families and so on. And if you read the autobiography of Mir Vilayat Hussain or the biography of Aziz Mirza, some of the early people, but also in the time I went there, there were a lot of people from very modest backgrounds. And yes, they might have the name Syed in front of their names, but that doesn't make them rich and powerful in the sense of what an elite might be. So Aligarh and Jamia were places, yes, for social mobility for a lot of people, and many of them just went on to live their lives outside the realms of politics. But of course, politics impinged, and now it impinges most terribly. And this issue of loyalty that I started with has become very worrisome, so that when was it? 4 years ago was the anniversary of the founding of the university in the 1920 founding. So we had 2020, it was founded. And who was the chief guest? Narendra Modi by Zoom. He didn't go there in person. And Narendra Modi gave a speech in which he did not use a single Persian or Arabic word, and did not recognize Muslims as even having anything to do with oligarchy. And the vice chancellor who invited him is now a member of the BJP. That's very worrisome. But this is we'll see what's happening in this election, and maybe things will get a little bit better.
Okay, so now we will enter into question and answer session, but before that, an announcement for the coming Saturday talk. We are going to move into Pakistan. It is about a hero there, a lost hero of Pakistan, Hemu Kalani from Sindh. And Raza Naeem has written a book, and he's going to talk on that. He has chosen one speaker from Pakistan and another from India. Saz Agrawal is from India, and Dr. Manzoor Ali Wasirio from Pakistan. And basically, all three are focusing on the Sindhi campaign and Sindhi literature and Sindhi patriotism during that period. So now over to Dr. Rafat Hussain for moderating the question and answer session. And I hope that you have a lot of questions to ask. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Raziuddin. And it was a wonderful treat to listen from Professor Dr. Gautier, and of course the concluding remark, our own Professor Lalieveld. And it's always a pleasure to see you both. And so the question and answer session is open now. You can raise your digital hand. That will be preferred because there will be a lot of questions. And of course, you can put your comment and question in the chat box. I see a lot of comments on chat box. So let's begin with the question. And Dr. Nazir Ahmad, please go ahead, and because it's will be better if you say yourself what you want.
Thank you so much for recognizing me. It was a very incisive lecture by the learned professor. I was reflecting on the contrast in the contributions made by the Muslim academies in southern India and those in northern India, and how the Muslim academies in southern India avoided the headwinds of nationalism that somehow overtook the academies in northern India, Aligarh and Jamia included. Now, the academies in southern India focused on inclusiveness, universality, spirituality, and they were able to radiate their influence not just throughout southern India, but also to the islands in Malaysia and Indonesia. Large number of students used to come there. So if you traverse through southern India, you find a large number of graduates from these academies who have in turn gone on to found institutions wherein you find not just a few hundred, but 20,000, 30,000, 50,000 students. And there is no issue of majoritarian, minority, etc. Indeed, the turbulence of partition was witnessed to a very marginal extent in southern India. So any comments on what is the function of education? Is it to expand the horizons of the mind and the heart? Or is it to somehow make a contribution to what we call politics in a narrow sense, European definition of politics? Or is it something more? That's my question, if you please.
Thank you for your question. So first of all, thank you for bringing in, southern institutions from southern India, because it is true that there's been a very large number of Muslim institutions, educational institutions that boomed in southern India. And actually, I do mention this, although it's of course not the main topic of my research, but I do mention this in one of the chapters when I look at basically how a wide range of actors, from businessmen to professionals, as well as religious organizations, played a key role in the expansion of Muslim educational institutions in southern India. And in that sense, southern India was way more dynamic than North India in that period. So I'm talking about the 60s, 70s, 80s. Regarding your point about the fact that you argue that basically academies in southern India focused on inclusiveness and spirituality. I would say that many actors at Jamia and Aligarh also did emphasize, for example, on spirituality. Certainly at Jamia, as I said, religious life was an extremely important part of the school's ethos. Now, when you ask your question about the function of education, is it to expand horizons or contribute to politics? My work is on the political history of institutions, and maybe that's why you have a feeling that these educational institutions are just about politics. Of course, they are not, and they played a very important part in promoting education among, different sections of India's population. As I said, not just Muslims, also non-Muslims, and among Muslims, among different sections of the population. You have increasing numbers of people coming from lower class background who really see AMU and Jamia as institutions that will allow that upward social mobility, which is something that Professor Lelyveld has mentioned, and that will also allow them to expand their horizons by giving them new job opportunities, but also access to new forms of culture. In that sense, I wouldn't reduce these institutions to being purely political institutions, even though my work primarily focuses on the political contributions of these institutions.
Thank you, Dr. Gautier. So the next comment or question is from Abdul Jabbar Saab. Please go ahead.
So I think Dr. Zarud, fantastic discussion today. Thank you, as always. I don't know how Razi Razuddin Saab brings this kind of forum discussions to the community. Very thankful for the team, for him. So I come from the deep south in India. So I went to Jamal Muhammad College in Trichy. That's about, then from there, I did my bachelor's degree in chemistry. I went to Madurai Kamaraj University for master's and PhD. I came here in 1981 to the US. So the discussion appears to be centered around the North Indian context, educational, other issues, history. I think it's when I went back to JMC after 47 years. I left 1972, went back 2019. I was impressed by the growth and development of the college. It almost looks like a university campus. So then I was looking around, looking for the history of the founding history of the college. Then I came across the book the French historian wrote about 2 years ago. So they gifted me the book. I just started reading the book. Then I had understanding. When I was a student, there was no discussion about the history of the founder. So now I just see the remarkable the vision the founder brought to bear to education to the southern India. Apparently, he is a contemporary of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The author also wrote about him in addition to the founder of JMC. And then, so if you look at that, also a very important point, the partition appears to have a painful memory for North Indians, not for us. So that always comes up in the discussions. The North Indians live the painful memories that memory doesn't seem to dissipate too much. It does, but it comes back because of that. Because that is very similar to what this country, the US, went through in terms of the Abraham Lincoln defeat of the South. That lingers even now in the southern part of the US. So I think very similar kind of history. The population, Indian population, the northern India is going through. I think it's you have to put that in the context. I think. Thank you very much for wonderful discussion. Hopefully we'll have more of that. Maybe there should be a southern perspective some point in this forum. That is what I'm plugging in here. So
Thank you.
I just
Thank
want
you,
to
Doctor. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for your comments. So first of all, to answer on this question of partition, and this actually a point that your predecessor made, and that I forgot to answer. I mean, partition certainly had an uneven impact on the subcontinent, and clearly it had a strongest impact, of course, in Bengal and Punjab, but also in northern India. First of all, because partition riots were extremely violent there, but also because you had so many migrants or displaced people who moved out of their homes during that period, while parts of their family also remained. So these are the territories and families that were most directly hit by that. On top of this, as we know, North India is also the center of Hindu communalism, which means that this marginalization, this feeling of marginalization as a minority group was even more stark in North India as compared to Southern India, where regional politics unfolded in a very different way and where the impact of partition was less. So that explains this, why people in North India remember partition more vividly maybe than in Southern India. And then, sorry, I had another point to make about Southern India, but I have forgotten. But yes, sorry, you're absolutely right. Historians tend to focus much more on North India as compared to Southern India, especially when we study Muslims' location in India. And actually, that's one of the reasons why my new research project will carry out different regional studies, including Kerala, Maharashtra, Hyderabad, and UP still, because UP, for better or for worse, is considered to be, the political heartland of India in many ways.
Thank you, Dr. Gautier. So there is another question from Riaz Ahmad Saab, and this is renaming of cities and roads in the past 10 years or so has been seen by certain people as an attempt of invisibilization of Muslim. In this context, how do you see the future of AMU and Jamia?
Well, I do agree with the idea that renaming is a way to invisibilize Muslims and invisibilize their contribution, the integral part that they play in India's history. It is difficult. I mean, I'm a historian. I study the past. I'm not able to predict the future, but there are several points that I want to make. One is that this whole idea of loyalty that Professor Lelyveld mentioned is very important, but because it shows how keen university authorities are to maintain their position, and for that they feel that obedience, absolute loyalty to the state authorities is a must. Now, students do not usually share that same position, and that's why you can have extremely deep divisions within the campus between those who support university authorities and students who often protest against this submission to state authorities. And I think as long as this debate can continue to happen, well, there's still a scope for democratic debate. That's the first thing. The other thing is, of course, we all know that the minority status of AMU and Jamia is currently at stake. It's under discussion at the Supreme Court. I think this will have an important impact because in the current political scenario, it seems that if both these institutions lose their minority status, then this might be used to further reduce, to further reduce the autonomy, whatever autonomy is left of these institutions. And depending on who is in power at the center, if universities lose their autonomy, then it may lead to, well, maybe a severe even invisibilization of the specific character.
So thank you. There is a similar question. Maybe you wanted to add something here. What do you think the challenges AMU and JMI face in this era? And are the institution equipped to handle them? This is from Faria Shah. So I
Sorry,
thought maybe I should take this.
Somehow I cannot read the question.
It's all the way in the bottom.
Okay. What possible
Bottom up. One bottom up. It's Laurence from Faria Shah.
Yes. What do you think are the challenges these institutions face in this era, and are the institutions equipped to handle them? That's a vast question.
It's not the last, but I took this question because it's a similar question. There are many more.
But I think, so I have already mentioned the very specific political context that we are in, of course, is a major a challenge, not just for Jamia and AMU, because we all know that the present politics are a challenge for universities across the country, where there's a tendency to delegitimize university politics as something that should not belong. I mean, politics as something that should not belong to universities, whereas people like, for example, Jürgen Habermas, but many other scholars would argue that actually universities have a fundamental function to perform in the maintenance of democracy, including through politics, through debates, and that's also one view that I share. So that's about the challenge also of a tendency towards the rise of privatization of higher education, which is again a challenge for all universities. And so then the question is also how well equipped will public institutions be to handle, on the one side, the increasing privatization of higher education, and the other side, the increasing demand for higher education. And I think here that, for example, in universities like Jamia and even Aligarh that have large sections of the population that are first generation learners play a key role. And so they should benefit from large public funding so that they can continue to perform their role as platforms to upward social mobility for all these first generation graduates.
Thank you. Sanobar Omar, please raised hand.
Yes. Hi, Professor Gautier. What a brilliant lecture. I'm so looking forward to reading your book now on such a great topic, and clearly you've done such great thorough research. I just have a couple of short questions. One is pertaining to how, during the CEA protests, we saw a lot of crackdown on both AMU and JMI. We have heard of instances of many young women incidentally in both the institutions being sexually assaulted by police forces. And of course, nothing was done to address that. So despite their very divergent legacies and founding principles, in what ways do you feel have they converged today? I was also wondering with regards to the whole controversy surrounding AMU's minority status and the Supreme Court ruling in, I think, was it earlier this year, February 2024? And my second question is in
last month.
Last year.
Last year, okay, in 2023. And my second quick question is, like David said, many people from humble backgrounds also went to AMU. I definitely come from a Muslim background, and all these stories of grandmothers selling their bangles to send their kids to AMU somehow for a better future. I have heard anecdotally that in the 1970s, often there were ads that said anyone may apply except students from AMU. So I was wondering if you came across such these job calls that explicitly stated students from AMU should not apply, or is that just hearsay? Thanks.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Omar, for your question. So I just want to specify that I did not do primary research work on the anti-CA protest. what I write in the conclusive part of my book is based on secondary research, not on my own personal research. But it seems that there are some converging trends, as you said, between the current debates on the minority status of these institutions and the treatment of students during the anti-CA protests. What I found striking, personally, so I was in Delhi at the time. What I found striking was that of all the universities where protests happened, including JNU, it's only at AMU and Jamia that the police intervened directly on campus, and that too forcefully. To me, it seems that this is quite revealing of the state's attitude towards Muslims specifically, not just university students in general. And I think that this, again, put against the questioning of the Muslim character of AMU and Jamia, and the very legitimacy of having a Muslim state-sponsored university, points towards a clear, tendency to treat Muslim citizens as having the choice between assimilating completely or basically accepting, accepting the fact that they would be treated as second-ranked citizens. So that for me, that's how I read it. Now, regarding your question on jobs and ads saying that, on advertisements saying that AMU students should not apply, I haven't come across such ads, but also I've not been looking for them. However, I remember very clearly that in the 1960s, before the beginning of the minority status campaign, there were many students would express their feeling that they would be discriminated against at the time of job application. And the vice chancellor of the time, Badruddin Tayyabji, himself seemed to share these impressions. He speaks about them in one of his reports. And actually, that's one of the reasons that he invokes to justify the increase of quotas at AMU for internal students to access the most competitive departments, engineering and the medical school, with the idea that if we at AMU do not provide Muslim students the best chances to compete in these job sectors, then who will? So I can't confirm that actual discrimination happened, but there was certainly a strong suspicion that it did at AMU.
Rafat, unmute yourself.
My apology. Okay, Rashad Saab, and then I will read
Hi. Thank you so much, Laurence, for such an insightful, excellent, and a wonderful presentation. I come from a political background, and I am an alumni of Jamia Millia Islamia. So it's been 13 years I've been working with the Indian National Congress, and I've spent almost 8 years in the bastion of Rahul Gandhi and Sonia Gandhi, in the bastion of Gandhi family constituency. Well, I'm not trying to make it communalize, but I have a bigger concern about the political representation of Muslims in India. When you said that Nehru has somewhat convinced Azad in and advocated for the removal of Muslim name from Aligarh Muslim University, if I have heard it right.
Sorry, can I just correct myself? I mean, maybe I was not clear. Both Nehru and Azad spoke about the fact that they would prefer to remove the word
All
Muslim.
Right. Yeah. So it's not only
but they did not seek to impose that decision. In fact, it seems that they did not really pursue this idea.
Okay. It's not about Azad and Nehru. Somewhere Jamia Millia Islamia, by the word Islamia, the word Islamia was also targeted, and it is clearly written by one of our author, former Union Minister Salman Khurshid, in his book At Home in India, The Muslim Saga. So one thing, when the name Muslim, Islamia or Millia comes, which is similar to Arabic or Urdu, so we see a sort of discrimination happening. But when you go back to Banaras Hindu University, so has people ever tried to communalize? Because I have been in the political sector, And I have a bigger concern about the representation of Muslims. But when you talk about Banaras Hindu University and try to compare Aligarh, Jamia, Jamia is a beacon of secularism. Jamia and Aligarh both has been a beacon of multiculturalism. And now recently, when you talk about, the minority status, very recently, 3 days back, Mr. Prime Minister has targeted Jamia Millia Islamia. And he said, in Dwarka, in one of a election rally in Dwarka, that Congress has always...
Rashasa, please come to the question or final.
Yeah.
conclusion.
So my question is very clear that, when we talk about Jamia and Aligarh, so do we really see Banaras Hindu University as also one of the institution which, goes with Hindu name?
Thank you.
Actually, that's a very good point, because when Nehru was critical or suggested, again, he did not, impose his decision, but when he said that he would rather remove the word Muslim, he also, from the name of AMU, he also said, I would also want to remove the word Hindu from BHU, because to him, having a public institution with a denominational name could encourage the revival of communal tendencies at a time when partition memories were still, very vivid in people's minds. Now, if you contrast this to today's situation, I read, and I'm not saying that this is the official position of any political party, but I have read clearly articles where politicians, at least one politician, protested against AMU's Muslim name. And when the journalist asked this person, what about BHU? He said, oh, no, but that's not an issue. Banaras Hindu University did not seem to be communal tag, whereas AMU's Muslim name was a problem to this person. And I think that this says something about the evolution of politics. Yes, I think I will answer with this point.
Thank you. Uzair Saab, do you want to read your question? Because you raised your hand.
Sure, yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Raziuddin. Professor Gautier, thank you so much for such an insightful and to-the-point presentation. My question was, again, about one of the universities that you have studied, AMU. And now that the center has slashed its budget so drastically, and all indications are that this trend will continue, how do you see this university carrying on its day-to-day operations? And is there any precedent that we can look at to understand this?
Oh, that's I'm not sure I'm equipped to answer this question, but I would just go back to my point about if we consider that until now, at least, AMU is supposed to cater for the educational advancement of all Indian Muslims, which is quite a task. And that the center, and we all know that, there are many reports, including the Sachar Committee reports, that show that on average, Muslims are socioeconomically disadvantaged as compared to other sections of the population. Then, it is really problematic to slash the budget of an institution which is supposed to cater to the needs of a very large population, that too one which is considered to be disadvantaged on many accounts. How will it face this? I'm afraid I do not have the answer to this question.
Thank you. There is another question in the chat box from Javed Hussain. What possible influences did the Jamians receive from the early days of freedom struggle and the post-partition days? And how much did they succeed in influencing the nation building and the masses of their idea of India?
Thank you for this question. So, of course, freedom struggle was the determining moment in defining Jamia's identity as an institution. And today, again, the role that Jamia Millia played in the freedom struggle is celebrated as something that really is supposed to characterize Jamia's character even till today. To what extent did Jamia was actually able to influence national politics is very difficult to say, but there was certainly an aspiration to play a role And of course, the Jamia, I mean, at least in the early independence period, of course, Jamia teachers, including Zakir Hussain and Mohammed Mujib, were keenly aware of the financial and material limitations of Jamia, because Jamia really faced many struggles when it came to its finances, and that, of course, hampered the expansion of their projects. However, they really thought of themselves as a laboratory where they could play the role of a pilot institution. In fact, this is an expression that another Jamia key member uses in the early 1950s. They wanted, in the post-independence context, now that the colonial authorities were gone, to play the role of a pilot institution which could test different forms of education that could then serve as a model for the new state authorities. Unfortunately, they did not quite get the support that they were expecting to get in Nehru's government, and that, of course, had a major impact on the influence that they could play on education and politics after independence. So there was certainly an aspiration and ambition in spite of this institution's limitations. But for lack of greater support from state authorities, I don't think that they were able to play such a key role.
Thank you. So there are some comments about the protest during the Ali Yavar Jangsa. I'm not going to take them. Unless they are interested, please raise your digital hand to it. So the next one is Muhammad Ashraf.
On the minority status, and I do talk at length about the attack.
Yeah.
I mean, not about the attack just only, but about the campaign. So it's full of details.
Yeah, they are more as a comment than the questions. So there is another question from Muhammad Ashraf. Where does Manu stands in all this debate? Is it restricted to the Southern perspective, or does it represent Muslim pan-India?
That's a good question. So first of all, I did not include Manu because it's a very recent institution. That's the first thing. The other thing is that, technically speaking, as far as I'm aware, and I'm not that familiar with the institution, so maybe I'm wrong, but my understanding is that Manu does not explicitly claim to be a Muslim institution, even though a large number of students and teachers may be Muslim. It is primarily thought of as a Urdu medium institution. And that is the defining character of the institution. It makes me think of Osmania, which was also established as an Urdu medium institution and was established, of course, by the Nizam of Hyderabad, who was himself a Muslim ruler. But as far as I'm aware, neither Osmania nor Manu were explicitly defined as Muslim institutions. And so I think this makes a difference. Now, in practice, large sections of students and teachers are Muslim. So it would be interesting maybe to see to what extent Manu is able to play the role of a crucible for debates around Muslims' location in India. But that's not something that I have examined, especially given the fact that it's a very recent institution.
Thank you. So Victor Ghalib Saab, please be ready to ask your question when I call you. So the next one is from Mehtab Azaz Saab. US is also witnessing the same tactic, silencing the voice of the campuses. Are we going through a more authoritarian regimes worldwide?
Yes, I think there is definitely, thank you for making this point. And this is also something that Professor Lelyveld was hinting at in his comments by speaking of Colombia. I think there is clearly a trend that is not restricted to India, but that we can see worldwide of repression of academic freedom and freedom of expression on university campuses. And in fact, there are studies that have shown that in the last 1 year, there's been a sharp decline in many countries of the world in academic freedoms. So thank you for pointing out that this is not restricted to India.
Thank you. Another one is from Nadeem Khan. What is the view of professor regarding aim of Sir Syed? Was it to produce educated middle class among Muslims or to provide political voice to them as well? So this is question about what was the aim of the Sir Syed?
I think maybe that's more a question for Professor Lelyveld. I would say both, but I think Professor Lelyveld may want to take this question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could you repeat the question?
So it's about, let me go back. Okay. was the aim of Sir Sayyid to produce educated middle class among Muslims, or to provide political voice to them as well?
Or to provide what?
Political voice.
Oh, well, I think his primary aim was to produce modern educated Muslims, and his concept of modern. And the political side of it, he said he didn't want to do politics at all. And his refusal to participate in the Congress was defended as best to stay out of politics. But of course, by saying that, he was doing something political. But in fact, he didn't do much of that. If you read Sir Syed's writings throughout that period, he wrote about politics in his earlier years. Of course, after 1857, he wrote very importantly about politics. But in the 1880s and 1890s, in his last years, most of his writings were about religion or other issues, and not much about politics. Other people, including the British principal of order, took up the political cause. It was not something that was at the forefront of his interests.
Thank you. There is a similar question from Abul Wase. So Victor Ghalib sir, please hold on for a second. And so this is a similar question. Given the current communal atmosphere, should the students and the staff at EMU be engaged in political activities or concentrate on their education? Either of you.
Professor Lelyvel, please.
No, it's not my place to tell them what to do, but if I were a student, I would probably be protesting and politically active. Yeah.
Thank you. So Victor Ghalib Saab, sorry about that. Please go ahead because you had so many comments. So let's listen directly from you.
Well, I just want to leave my question in the chat box, however.
But there are so many.
You call my name, you know.
No, I got lost because there are so many. I'm so sorry.
Right.
Please go ahead.
Okay, you know, when I heard Zahid Saab's comment about why the Muslim name is targeted, I thought of the school I went to in Hyderabad. I went to the St. George's Grammar School run by Australians. They had a big church next door, and they didn't really preach, but it was kind of, you know, changing our culture, I guess. It was an elite school. You know, they had gospel and acts, and morning started with an assembly with Lord's Prayer. So my question was, are they? I don't know if I know. I'm here since 1969 in America, so I don't know what's going on. Are those schools are still today existing Christian school? Are they equally targeted as Muslim names are? That's my question.
I'm not sure I have the full picture on the situation. What I can say is that I know that quite a few Christian organizations, and that includes Christian schools, are concerned about the removal of what is called the FCRA. The FCRA is basically something that allows you to get foreign funding, and there are quite a few NGOs as well as schools in India, sometimes which are Christian, sometimes which are Muslim, sometimes which have nothing to do with any religion or religious community, that depend on the FCRA because they depend on foreign funding. And it so happens that in the last few years, a lot of associations and schools, including Christian schools, have lost their FCRA, which means that their survival is at stake because they no longer have sufficient funding. So it is true that we should also think of what happens to, I would say, the other most targeted religious minority, which is the Christians, because what Christians and Muslims share in the Indian context is this idea that, I mean, they are stigmatized because of the idea that both Islam and Christianity are supposedly alien to, are not essentially Indian religions.
Okay, thank you. We are running out of time, so please be brief. There are a couple more questions I'm going to take. And there is one from Professor Naqvi. Qaid-e-Azam Ahmed Jinnah bestowed a big amount of money in his will to AMU to thank them for their contribution to the Muslim struggle for independence. India's reaction to this noble gesture was quite of surprise and negative. Any comments? So please be brief and
Sorry, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the beginning of the sentence. Can you please?
okay, let me repeat again. Qaid-e-Azam M.A. Jinnah bestowed a big amount of money in his will to AMU to thank them for their contribution to the Muslim struggle for independence. India's reaction was negative and surprising. What is your comment?
Well, I think it shows that in the aftermath of partition, Indian state authorities considered that it was indispensable to make the border clear between India and Pakistan at a time when the border was clearly not clear, neither in reality nor in people's minds. And one way of doing that was to, well, clearly, say that either you're loyal to us, the Indian state, or we consider that you can't be trusted as citizens. And I think in this context, Indian Muslims, especially at AMU, which had such strong connections with the Muslim League, university authorities had little choice but to show their undivided loyalty to the Indian nation state. And that meant distancing themselves from all that Muslim League legacy, but also from all the remaining connections that they had with alumni who now occupied key positions in Pakistan's state apparatus. If you look at, Pakistani state authorities in the 1950s, there are quite a few AMU alumni. And so, of course, that put the university in a difficult position, because that was one thing that was invoked against them, and that was invoked to stigmatize them as a hotbed of Muslim separatism and a fifth columnists, basically.
So I am going through all the comments and questions. If I missed anyone, please remind me, because there are so many and I keep noting them. But you can raise your digital hand or remind me. So the next one is from Mustafa Zadi. I ask you to unmute, please go ahead. Mustafa Zadi. Hopefully, let me check if he is still there. Sometimes people leave. No, he is still there. Okay, we will come back to you, Mustafa Zadi. So, is there anyone? Because I think I have taken all the comments, but if there is any. So, Razi Bhai, I'm giving you back.
Your own question, no? You don't want to raise any question?
We are already around 1 o'clock. So go ahead. I know you will ask my question, and so and call one more time Mustafa Zadi, if he is still there.
Mustafa Zadi Saab, are you still here?
I'm asking to unmute him.
His hand is raised. And there are two.
Okay.
Mustafa,
He just unmuted himself and then muted again.
maybe he is driving or he has a problem. Anyway,
let me ask him to unmute. Okay, he can ask a question if he comes online. Please go ahead. Razi Bhai, thank you so much. Before I hand over to Dr. Raziuddin, and of course, I like to thank Dr. Gautier and Professor Lalivand. Of course, if it is on Aligarh, Aligarhians and Muslims are excited. That's why there were so many comments and questions. Thank you both for a wonderful discussion and taking all the questions. And of course, I would like to thank the audience to remain engaged. Thank you. And it was a pretty good crowd today. Thank you.
So Rafat did a very good job, especially pronouncing your name. He was in France for 4 or 5 years. So he can speak fairly reasonably good French, though obviously he cannot speak. He is not speaking here with us, but he was there for a long time. And he corrects me sometimes when there is a need. So thank you so much. It was really very good discussion, a lot of questions raised. The one thing, to you both, after almost 7
Read the book, by the way. There's much more in it.
Yeah. So I'm not asking the any political that question because there's a lot of politics related to Aligarh as well as to Jamia, different kind of politics. So in 70 years or rather 100 years of their existence, from 20, the rebellion starts and both are like 100 years old as a mature institution. And Jamia has risen to a, I mean, so impressive level that nobody could have even imagined, not to our family at least, who were witnessing from madrasa to all that, to the top rated institution, even surpassing Aligarh actually in the rating couple of times, and next only to JNU sometimes. It is remarkable and became very modern institution. Aligarh obviously was quite modern, but so how do you rate the educational standard or function or the intellectual atmosphere between the two? Are there any kind of bonding between the two? Still, they are two parallel currents for the same cause, Muslim education. How do you see these institutions?
So I think that, you know, throughout this period, even if Jamia and AMU had distinct trajectories, that's why I insist upon the fact that they're still closely intertwined, because people kept on moving from one institution to the other. For a very long time, higher education was not so much at Jamia. As a result, many Jamia alumni went to AMU for their studies, and you had many AMU trained students who then moved to Jamia to teach. Now what is happening is, well, you still have these movements still happen. I mean, at the last book talk I gave, there were people who had clearly, you know, been to these multiple institutions, and I'm sure that many of you will also have multiple affiliations, I mean, with both AMU and Jamia. So there are still connections that are there. But you were talking also about something else, which is the different, I mean, now this idea that Jamia has taken over AMU. I think here we have to bear in mind the context, the urban and regional context in which these two institutions are. Jamia used to be a small school in a rural periphery of Delhi. It was not part of the city. If you look at photographs of the early Jamia history, you will see that it was surrounded by fields and there were some villages, but it was certainly not part of the city. Whereas now it has become a full part of the capital. On top of this, Delhi itself has undergone a major growth in demographic terms, but also in economic terms and political terms, which means that you know, Jamia has become now an institution in what is a booming capital city. So by contrast, AMU now appears often to be increasingly as a provincial institution in UP, not in, you know, Aligarh remains a rather, I don't want to say a town, but it's not a very large and, you know, it's not one of the most dynamic cities, certainly not compared to Delhi. And as a result, it's true that Jamia has greatly benefited from being part of the capital. For example, now there are many teachers who, if given the choice, would prefer to go to Jamia as compared to Aligarh, which was probably not the case earlier, unless they had a strong commitment to Jamia's ideology. So I think that here we really have to bear in mind the context. But that said, if you look at the rankings, I mean, both universities are actually doing pretty well in spite of that publicity that they may get. So that's in itself quite remarkable.
Razi bhai, hold on. My sincere apology to miss one of the question, and thank you, Mohammad Zaid Saab, to remind me. And that question is for Professor David. Sir Syed is accused of not letting backward caste Muslim be part of AMU equally. Very standard question.
That question haunts Sir Syed.
Hans, what is your view on this? Does this accusation hold any weight? I have a lot to say on that.
You know, it's not something that that comes up in his writings that much. But before Oliger was established, he wrote a kind of comprehensive concept of how to reform education for Muslims. And he talked about education for rural people, which was an education for artisans, and education for people who will go on as teachers or officials and so on. So he thought of, but you have to remember this was the 19th century. Oxford and Cambridge were not open to many people, and the universities in the United States weren't. So it's the idea of higher education being available to the larger population. This is a product of modern democracy, and actually Laurence in her book talks about the amazing expansion of education at the university level. Although you have to say that India and Pakistan lagged behind in basic primary education. That was Zakir Hussain was dedicated to that, but in fact, compared to other countries like China and so on, India did not have a good base in primary education. If you don't have a strong base in primary education, you're not going to have much in at the university level, and that in fact remains a problem.
Thank you. And last attempt for Mustafa Zaidi Saab. I think he's not there.
We should give up too. So the last word is that first time I heard Dr. Nazir Sahab and Dr. Abdul Jabbar, both from Southern India, sort of a little bit frustrated with the fact.
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I agree too that most of the focus somehow is on the larger Indian.
Not a frustration, a clarification. I'm just.
I understand. I understand. It was just a relaxed language. So, being friend, I mean, we just cover on the North India, Central India, even Bengal. Although you will see that Bengali Muslim, their heritage is also not very much covered. Half of the population, I mean, huge population, is not really very much covered. We don't or never went beyond Calcutta, or that too because of Maulana Azad. Had he not been there, maybe. And so probably the literature is not available. I would love to invite scholars if I see, I mean, the literature, if it is coming from South, should be visible in the marketplace or in the institutions. It is more regional. That's why it doesn't reach to the larger Indian, even larger Indian Muslim context. Sir Sayyid is everywhere, but really something happening in Tamil Nadu or Kerala is very much successful, but localized there. It is not even influencing Bombay. So, I mean, that doesn't mean to say that, but if you can bring, I would love to invite. And
yes, I did corresponded with you about the founder of the Jammu College. There's a book written by French historian. I think we will revisit that some point.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay, Razi Bhai, one more question, and my sincere apology to that person also, because there were so many and I missed that one. Thank you for reminding me. It's by the name iPhone. The basic purpose to establish the educational institution was education is an important part for political empowerment of the Muslims, which was not discussed by both scholars of a legal movement. So do you want to say something, any of you, please? And my sincere apology for that person. I'm so sorry.
Sorry, so the question is education being important to political empowerment.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, I can only agree with this, and I think
Obvious.
Professor Lelyveld will be much better positioned to answer this question when it comes to suicide's own position. But it seems to me that by wanting to preserve, by basically wanting to promote modern education among Muslims, suicide was also trying to make sure that they retain a favorable political position in the new colonial setup. But maybe I think Professor Lelyveld would be much better positioned to comment on that.
Yeah.
Well,
And
it depends what you mean by political, and it's important to understand that it was not in Sir Syed's concept of a modern politics of parties and elections. It was coming in, and he worked with it and tried to understand it, but basically that's not what he thought about representation, and that was in a very different sense. So he wanted he was on the Viceregal Council, for example.
So David, then recently, not recently, I keep on reading on this Sir Syed's legacy. If he was not, I mean, this is just a discussion here, if he was really apolitical, whether he was apolitical, but if suppose we consider in India that he was apolitical and nothing, no association with the concept of Pakistan. But in Pakistan, he is considered one of the three founding fathers. So how did they take it? How did they really go so deep to consider him as I mean, how, if he was really apolitical, then how do they accept him as really they embrace him? So
well, he played a big role in formulating a notion of the Muslim Qawm, of the Muslims as a united entity within India, not the Ummah, not world Islam, but and even though his vision was a little limited to the regional that he could reach, nonetheless he did reach out to Bombay and to some extent and Calcutta and wanted to. He had this notion of the Indian Muslims. He wasn't the first to come up with, but the Indian Muslims as an entity.
But did he
wasn't thinking in terms of nation state? He wasn't thinking in terms of Pakistan or anything like that.
Like Iqbal was very emphatic.
Iqbal, by the time Iqbal came along, he was much more aware of the political implications, but he also did not. If you read actually what Iqbal said, he was not calling for a Pakistan in any sense.
What about his Allahabad address?
But he wanted a defined Muslim polity and a part of where Muslims could develop their own institutions and so on. But the idea of the nation state, this is something that people didn't understand. And actually, in Laurence's book, she talks about this the period of transition where people could cross the border from Aligarh, and the Pakistanis wanted to recruit people into the army and the civil service and so on. And sometimes it was okay. They were allowed to do that for some time, because the idea that partition would mean a border that you couldn't cross without a passport, and that there ultimately would be two armies facing each other, and now two nuclear-powered military establishments facing each other. That really wasn't understood by many people, although some people did. Zakir Hussain understood that was what
So there is a I'm sorry. we have run over time, but there is one more question appeared, and
Oh
it
my
is,
goodness, it's still going.
and this is most likely
They are tired.
by David, and it's in the reference to student union election. So he's saying, when we talk about the contribution of these institutions in national politics, how do we address such issues when student union elections in these institutions has suspended? So I think David will be the right person to answer that.
Well, actually, Laurence talks about the student union elections, and it's a very interesting subject that somebody could even do more with, I think. I remember from the late 60s when the whatever it was called, the more Islamicist group is using the term today was up against the more nationalist or even Marxist.
You went to the wrong. You went at a very wrong time.
Yeah, but I was talking to one of the student leaders of who was Jamaati Islami, and I said, "And where are you from?" He's from Bihar. And what do your family do? Oh, we have a liquor business.
Okay, that concludes the question and answer session. And I'm sorry, Parvez Alam Saab, your question couldn't be taken because we have run over the time. And thank you both. Unless Rajibai wants to continue.
No. I don't want to say anything except that we should re-invite them soon on a totally on Sir Syed. I mean, really, we want to talk a lot, or at least listen a lot.
It's an endless subject. It's an endless subject. What time is it in Delhi, by the way?
Rajibai, find
it's very late.
Rajibai, find a topic on the women education by Sir Syed, because that's a very controversial issue that has never been settled.
It's not going very far. There is no. Maybe Sheikh Abdullah should be brought for that college. But women education becomes the women education and Pasmanda. These two issues will haunt Sir Syed, whether rightly or.
No, I kind of don't agree with that but anyway, because he was not against the education, he just prioritized men at that time, and of course it filtered down to the women of today.
Another Syed is talking. His name is Syed.
I think he just prioritized because he couldn't take it. So anyway, thank you so much. And Laurence and David, it was wonderful. And you see how much it went over, almost 12 minutes, so 2.5, almost 2.25.
Sorry.
So good to see you, David, again. And Dr. Gautier, it was great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rajibai, for inviting them and the audience.
Yeah, thank you all. And we will see another Saturday for the coming other session. Thank you. Bye. And you must be hungry, Dr. Gautier. Quite late for you, David.
But thank you again for inviting me. This was a great opportunity. Thank you.